13th Amendment to the Constitution, passed in 1865 after the Civil War, abolished slavery with one exception: when someone commits a crime. Although the 13th Amendment has been considered a significant civil rights victory for blacks in America, a closer look shows that there are more blacks incarcerated and working for free against their will in America than during slavery. A documentary written by Ava DuVernay explores this injustice. This is a 5-part series in which we will take a look at the Netflix movie 13th, which refers to the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. In this series, we will look at the history of mass incarceration of the black community, including the role of the media and politics, and why it's not only a problem for the African American community, it affects us all. In this episode, we will look at the wording of the amendment and the role of the media in mass incarceration. The wording of the 13th Amendment gives a legal loophole to permit continuing ongoing slavery.
The 13th Amendment to the Constitution makes it unconstitutional for someone to be held as a slave. In other words, it grants freedom to all Americans. There are exceptions, including criminals.
There's a clause, a loophole.
If you have that embedded in the structure, in this constitutional language, then it's there to be used as a tool for whichever purposes one wants to use it.
We now have more African Americans under criminal supervision than all the slaves back in the 1850s.
We are the products of the history that our ancestors chose. Products of that set of choices that we have to understand in order to escape from it.
The strongest influence of public opinion is the media. Democracy Now! Discuss the role of the media in shaping the perception of blacks as criminals.
This whole issue that you deal with in the film of how the media perpetuates the image of black criminality and stirs up the constant public fear.
Yes, no, it's a big part of the fabric of the documentary. Just as Corey Green, a great activist from New York, says in the piece that you just saw, it's all about creating a context of fear. And once you create the other, that's what's been done for to African Americans over the course of history, this otherness that's allowed this fear to creep in, and it embeds itself in politics and, issues of progress and profit and power building, for the last, I guess, 8 decades now.
In this episode, we will examine the political climate and attitudes of politicians and how those politicians contributed to the disproportionate mass incarceration of the black population. In the civil rights movement of the 60s and early 70s, blacks fought for equality under the law, and in response, the FBI treated peaceful civil rights leaders as subversive, dangerous, and criminal.
Angela Davis is a human rights activist, a scholar, and an author. She came to prominence in the late 60s and early 70s during the Black Power era. During that time, she became involved with the prison movement because she was accused of complicity in a murder that took place. And she spent 16 months in jail. And she was already concerned about the conditions of prisoners, but as she came to know the prisoners and what it was actually like to be a prisoner herself, she gained a lot more interest and passion for that movement.
The Free Angela button is on display at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. What does the button say?
The button, Free Angela and All Political Prisoners, that button represents the movement that rose when she was in prison. So that's one of the reasons that she was ultimately acquitted, because this huge movement took place not just in the United States, but internationally. And those buttons were worn by people, and there were protests taking place all over the place, including outside of her prison. The idea of a political prisoner in the 70s came to mean literally anyone who is incarcerated, especially a person of color, because the idea is that the system itself is oppressive. Even though you yourself may not have been an actual activist, if you are arrested like George Jackson was because you're poor and black and end up spending the rest of your life in prison, then you're a political prisoner.
So they were kind of targeting like the whole justice system.
Although he's a celebrated national hero now, Martin Luther King Jr. was another enemy of the FBI during the civil rights movement.
The FBI kept the civil rights leader under constant surveillance. In PBS American Experiences Roads to Memphis, journalist Gerald Posner discusses the FBI's surveillance of Dr. Martin Luther King.
We now know from the documents released by the FBI, an FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, who had a pathological hatred of Martin Luther King, so much so that he directed his own agents to break the law repeatedly in going after King and taping King and having illegal surveillance on King.
The almost fanatical zeal with which the FBI pursued King is now well known, and many other secrets about the history and practices of the FBI are no longer secret.
The prejudice against blacks was not only held by the FBI. The prejudice was a reflection of society itself, which had been influenced by the media, as was shown in the previous episode of this series. The political climate was such that politicians had to take a law and order position against blacks to obtain the popular vote.
It became virtually impossible for a politician to run and appear soft on crime.
The kinds of kids that are called super predators.
Millions of dollars will be allocated for prison and jail facilities.
3 strikes and you are out.
Having learned from the FBI's attack on black leaderships during the civil rights movement, as racial tensions became worse during the 2015 and 2016 presidential campaign season, Black Lives Matter formed its power structure from this learned behavior of the civil rights movement.
The structure of the Black Lives Matter movement is very purposeful. There is not one leader. We have a whole section in 13th about the takedown of black leadership in this country. Van Jones says it so beautifully. You can't talk about white leadership in America and never mention the FBI one time. Yet when you talk about black leadership, all of our leaders have been touched by the FBI, by surveillance, by some kind of aggressive police enforcement, and it's really wiped out so much of what would have been great leadership. And so it's important for us to kind of tip a hat to the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not centralized, so it's harder to shift power. It's everywhere, and so that's much more powerful.
Following the 2016 presidential election of Donald Trump, the indivisible resistance movement imitated the Black Lives Matter power structure. No leadership, just local organizers in counties, townships, and municipalities. Donald Trump ran with divisive anti-race rhetoric that stirred ethnic tensions. In this episode, Ava DuVernay sits down with Democracy Now! To discuss the clips in the documentary 13th involving Donald Trump, going back to his comments involving the Central Park Five.
In 1989, 5 African-American and Latino teenagers were arrested for beating and raping a white woman in New York City's Central Park. They became known as the Central Park Five. The teenagers initially confessed, I put that in quotes, but soon recanted, insisting they had admitted to the crime under the duress of exhaustion and coercion from police officers. This is a clip of 13th.
Last night, the 18s accused in the attack were arraigned on charges of rape and attempted murder.
In the Central Park jogger case, they put 5 innocent teens in prison because the public pressure to lock up these quote-unquote animals was so strong.
You better believe that I hate the people that took this girl and raped her brutally. You better believe it.
Donald Trump wanted to give these kids a death penalty, and he took out a full-page ad to put the pressure on. These children, 4 of them under 18, all went to adult prisons for 6 to 11 years before DNA evidence proved they were all innocent.
So that's a clip from 13th, the Central Park Five. The city of New York just reached a multi-million-dollar settlement with them. But Donald Trump continues to say that they're guilty. Ava DuVernay.
Well, I mean, this is the atmosphere of Trump. It is dangerous. It is from no basis of fact. It's completely fabricated to continue to demonize these men after they've been found not guilty, after they've been awarded losses by the city. It's stunning, but it's to be expected at this point, and it's something that we need to start to understand is going to be the new normal. And so folks, especially artists, the community that I am a part of, really have to be diligent and rigorous in our opposition to it through our work.
The troubling thing here is not that Donald Trump took out a tough on crime ad and put it in the paper. It's that he ignores facts for political gain. and his failure to admit when he's wrong. This was the late 80s. Now let's look at modern day.
You have a powerful scene in there where you show in 13th Donald Trump prominently. It shows a black woman being pushed by a white Trump supporter at a rally as Trump is saying, in the good old days, this doesn't happen because they used to treat them very rough. And when they protested once, they wouldn't do it again so easily. Mm-hmm. What do the good old days mean?
Oh, yeah. Well, the good old days, we juxtapose images of Trump at his rallies during the campaign with, images of civil rights abuses happening in the 60s. We juxtapose them against the Bloody Sunday footage out of Selma. That same atmosphere of ignorance and hate and criminalization and oppression is what, it's hard for me to say president, but what he espouses. And so that footage is important to have. It's something that I want to make sure that we're watching again, during the inauguration when he raises his hand. And I think it's going to be a real sobering moment for the country when you see the power of images, the power of him taking the oath. My hope is that shakes people out of some of the, certainly not your viewers, but many other people out of this kind of reality show haze that we seem to find ourselves in. It is real, it is happening, and we have to remember what he said and continue to hold him accountable.
It's not just his rhetoric, his campaign rallies, and the hate that he stirs in others, particularly his zealous supporters. It's also the discriminatory and unconstitutional laws that he proposes. Here's an example.
Well, part of what's real is that Donald Trump has called for a nationwide stop and frisk program. This is Trump speaking in September at a town hall meeting at an African-American church in Cleveland hosted by Fox News.
There's been a lot of violence in the black community. I want to know, what would you do to help stop that violence, black on black crime?
Right. Well, one of the things I'd do, Ricardo, is I would do stop and frisk. I think you have to. We did it in New York. It worked incredibly well. And you have to be proactive. And, you really help people sort of change their mind automatically. You understand. You have to have, in my opinion, I see what's going on here. I see what's going on in Chicago. I think stop and frisk. In New York City, it was so incredible the way it worked. Now, we had a very good mayor, but New York City was incredible the way that worked. So I think that would be one step you could do.
Of course, Trump there is rewriting some of the history. In New York, it was declared unconstitutional by a federal judge, and the way it was being implemented in New York. And at one point, it was up to 700,000 people a year were being stopped by New York City police.
It's a jaw dropper, and the fact that it's just kind of embraced. It's why shows like yours and the work that documentarians are doing across the board is so important. This fake news, this complete rewriting and distortion of history is how we will continue to go to a more dangerous place. And so it takes, calling it out whenever we see it, playing it again, making sure people listen, fact-checking this stuff. You only hope some of this gets through to folks.
In this episode, we will discuss the law and its disparate enforcement upon the black community, which created a school-to-prison pipeline. Presidents Reagan and Clinton each took action which built, and if it didn't build, certainly expanded the school-to-prison pipeline in black communities. Shortly after Reagan became president in 1981, he and Nancy Reagan delivered a speech on the war on drugs. Then, driven by the 1986 cocaine overdose of the black basketball star Len Bias, Reagan was able to pass the Anti-Drug Abuse Act through Congress. This legislation appropriated an additional $1.7 billion to fund the war on drugs. Bill Clinton signed a crime bill that he admitted made the school-to-prison pipeline worse. The 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill that Clinton signed included the federal three strikes provision, mandating life sentences for criminals convicted of a violent felony after 2 or more convictions, including drug crimes.
To young people watching or listening, I have a very personal message for you. Say yes to your life. And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
In 1982, Nancy Reagan's famous words, "Just say no," were popularized from a speech she gave as President Reagan waged his war on drugs. Nancy was the public face of the Just Say No campaign, making appearances to garner public support for the tough anti-crime and drug policies that later proved to be ineffective. Although the Reagan administration presented the war on drugs as a way to save kids' lives, it became a vehicle that destroyed many lives through mass incarceration. While drug use prevention initiatives such as DARE failed miserably to deter children from using drugs, policies such as zero tolerance and drug-free school zones managed to criminalize young people, especially African Americans. In 1980, nearly 15% of all juvenile drug arrests were black youth. By 1990, black youth constituted nearly 49% of all juvenile drug arrests. Just 8 years after Nancy Reagan's now infamous speech, over that same time period, the black population in the United States grew from 11.7% to just over 12%. That's an increase of only 3.4% over the decade. The number of black youth that were arrested in that same period grew by over 236.5%. This disparity remains despite the fact that a number of studies have shown that black and white youth participate in drug use and sale at just about the same rate. In 1986, 4 years after Nancy Reagan's Just Say No speech, Congress passed the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, mandating a zero-tolerance policy for drugs or alcohol on public school grounds. After the law was passed, the incarceration rate of juveniles continued to balloon. From 1986 to 1996, white juveniles sent to prison for drug offenses doubled. However, young blacks incarcerated for drug offenses grew sixfold. By 1996, black youth were 3 times more likely than white juveniles to get sent to prison for drug offenses. Along with the dramatically increased incarceration rates, school suspensions also increased. Fewer than 4% of students were being kept out of school as a punishment in the 1970s. Suspension rates for all students has nearly doubled from 3.7% in 1973 to 6.9% in 2006. With the advent of zero tolerance, black children experienced a 150% increase in suspension rates, from 6% in 1973 to 15% in 2006. Meanwhile, the white suspension rate gained less than 50% increase, growing from 3.1% to 4.8%. The suspension rate gap between blacks and whites has grown from 3 percentage points in the 70s to over 10 percentage points in the 2000s. In other words, black students are now over 3 times more likely to be suspended than white students. President Reagan's failed policy to sway children away from drug addiction became a pathway to suspension and ultimately prison. Nationally, the United States is incarcerating youth at a rate that is almost 5 times greater than that of South Africa, the country with the next highest youth incarceration rate. The United States youth incarceration rate is 7 times greater than that of the UK, 14 times greater than Germany's, and over 3,000 times greater than Japan's. Over 2 decades after Nancy's Just Say No declaration, African Americans continue to feel the disproportionate ramifications of the war on drugs, representing 26% of juvenile arrests, 44% of youth who are detained, 46% of youth who are judicially waived to criminal court, and 58% of the youth admitted to state prisons. So the next time we hear the war on drugs, we'll remember that there's a school to prison pipeline. And we'll say, just say no.
There's a 2-part problem here. Not only was there a disproportionate application of the law against blacks and black children, the laws were written to crack down on poor minority communities. For instance, according to the ACLU, there is a 100-to-1 crack versus powder cocaine sentencing disparity under which distribution of just 5 grams of crack carries a minimum of 5 years prison sentence, while distribution of 500 grams of powder cocaine carries that same 5-year mandatory minimum sentence.
It was an enormous burden on the black community, but it also violated a sense of core fairness.
Ava DuVernay discusses the influence of the law and mass incarceration with Democracy Now!
One of the things that most struck me in the film is as you deal with the policies of each president since Nixon, you then show the growth of the prison population as a result of those policies. And some of the most astounding growth, of course, occurred under Bill Clinton in the period of Bill Clinton.
Yes, we start the film off with statistics that are given by Obama, and we go back through Nixon, through Reagan, through Bush 1, and through Clinton. Those are really the years where the boom happened, where we started to, the architecture was laid, the foundation was laid for the current problem. And so we really delved into those presidencies and really examined what each administration did to get us to where we are now. Surprisingly, we had some criticism for including the Clintons there, but ultimately everyone did what they did. And so we just have to recount what that was so that we understand where we are going forward, which is to a scary place, I think.
Private prisons played a key role. The Luzerne County Kids for Cash scandal revealed an enormous problem that private prisons cause. Judges or politicians with financial ties to prisons are more likely to imprison children who have criminal law issues in the county. And in Delaware County, Councilman Brian Zidek uncovered a problem for a private prison contractor who is a heavy political donor to the Law and Order political party. At a forum, he discussed the following regarding the George Hill Correctional Facility in Delaware County.
And if you've ever read an annual report filed with the SEC, you'll note that there's a section where they talk about the risks to their business. With the GEO Group, they talk about factors that could cause actual results to differ materially from those expressed or implied by the forward-looking statements in this report. And one of them is our ability to maintain or increase occupancy rates at our facilities. So their investors know, hey, this is a risk of us making money. If we can't keep these jails and prisons filled, we might not make as much money.
The states were required to keep these prisons filled, even if nobody was committing a crime.
It's so difficult to talk about mass incarceration because it has become heavily monetized.
The focus is on taking people from prison, putting them in community corrections, parole and probation.
How much progress is it really if now there's a private company making money off the GPS monitor?
A prison system should not be placed in a conflict of interest between profit and the quality of life of citizens. Where a corporation has a fiduciary duty to shareholders and not the interest of prisoners, there is a huge danger for civil rights violations. The 13th Amendment explores the problems of mass incarceration. But why should you care if you've never been incarcerated, are well educated, and have all your needs met?
Why should I care about those people who are incarcerated?
People say they cry when they watch it.
Yeah.
People become very emotional. I think the place that you enter it is from your base of knowledge and how much you know,
Yeah.
how much you didn't know, how much you maybe had a feeling about that you ignored.
And also realizing how much you didn't care before. I've talked to a lot of
big
people
one.
who never even thought about it.
Right.
Never thought about it.
Don't have to think about it.
Yeah, because they don't have to think about
But
it.
if we're forward-thinking people, if we're members of the world in a way that we believe in justice and dignity, then you have to.
If the government and the media can turn on one ethnicity or any small segment of the population, it can turn on anyone. In the mid-1940s, the United States War Department issued an educational video teaching everyone in America not to turn on any minority group.
And some of the things I see in this country of ours make my blood boil. I see people with foreign accents making all the money. I see Negroes holding jobs that belong to me and you. Now I ask you, if we allow this thing to go on, what's going to become of us real Americans?
I've heard this kind of talk before, but I never expected to hear it in America.
This fellow seems to know what he's talking about.
Yes, he knows all right.
What's the answer? What are we real Americans going to do about it? You'll find it right here in this little pamphlet. The truth about Negroes and foreigners. The truth about the Catholic Church. Now, friends, these books are free. Paid for by real Americans who want others to know the truth.
Excuse me, young man, but are you actually going to read that stuff?
Sure, why not? You heard what he said, didn't you?
Yes, I heard. But do you believe in that kind of talk?
I don't know, makes pretty good sense to me.
I'm speaking to you as an American. And I tell you, friends, we'll never be able to call this country our own until it's a country without. Without what? Yeah, without what? Without Negroes. Without alien foreigners. Without Catholics. Without Freemasons. You know these people.
What's wrong with the Masons? I'm a Mason. Hey, that fella's talking about me.
And that makes a difference, doesn't it?
These are your enemies.
Before he said Masons, you were ready to agree with him.
Well, yes, but he was talking about... What about those other people?
But in this country, we have no other people. We are American people, all of us. We human beings are not born with prejudices. Always they are made for us. Made by someone who wants something. Remember that when you hear this kind of talk. Somebody is going to get something out of it. And it isn't going to be you.
A lesson or purpose of the documentary 13th is to issue a warning to America's society. The huge for-profit billion-dollar private prison industry is tied to politicians with millions of dollars in donations, and it needs to fill its greedy appetite by keeping its prisons full.
Well, there's only so many black and brown people. So after that, they have to keep the prisons filled. So who do they go after? This is something that everyone needs to be thinking about and defending themselves against. There are this thing morphs, right? And it takes on new forms. And what it wants is violent and insidious, and it's going to go after whatever it needs to feed itself. That's what it's been like for the last 110 years. So it's something that everyone should be attuned to because we're all affected by it.
For 140 years, blacks were the primary persecuted minority. After the World Trade Center attacks in 1993 and then 9/11 in 2001, Muslims were the next vilified class in line for abuse. In a documentary, Ethos, starring Woody Harrelson, it explored the role of the Muslim as the villain.
The corporate interests that stand to benefit are so intertwined and interwoven with the political forces that the financial elites and the political elites have become the same people.
The attack came without warning, and according to a U.S. government source, told CBS News that it has Middle East terrorism written all over it.
The attack in Oklahoma City appears to have a familiar mark. This was done with the attempt to inflict as many casualties as possible. That is a Middle Eastern trait.
The fact that it was such a powerful bomb in Oklahoma City immediately drew investigators to consider deadly parallels that all have roots in the Middle East.
ABC News has learned that the FBI has asked the U.S. military to provide up to 10 Arabic speakers to help in the investigation.
The so-called independent media in a liberal society like this, in effect, are so lazy and are controlled by interests that are commercial and political at the same time that there is no investigative reporting. It's just basically repeating the line of the government.
Only 8 days ago, I concluded a broadcast on the World Trade Center bombing by telling you what senior U.S. law enforcement officials were telling us, that the threat of Muslim extremists operating within the United States is an ongoing danger, something we'll have to live with from now on.
And repeating the lines of the people who have the most influence, for whom Islam is a useful foreign demon to turn attention away from the inequities and problems in our own society. So, as a result, the human side of the Islamic and especially Arabic world are rarely to be found. And the net result is this vacancy on the one hand, and these easy, almost automatic images of terror and violence. The situation in the popular media is basically that Muslims are really two things. One, they're villains of one sort, villains and fanatics. And B, many films end up with huge numbers of bodies, Muslim bodies, strewn all over the place, the result of Arnold Schwarzenegger or Demi Moore, Chuck Norris. Lots of films about guerrillas going in to kill Muslim terrorists. So the idea of Islam is something that to be stamped out. it's easy to attract attention, and certainly the media's attention, for some of the political reasons that are obvious. I mean, to discredit the Arabs, to make them seem like a threat to the West, to keep the idea around at the end of the Cold War that, you know, there are foreign devils. Otherwise, what are we doing with this gigantic military?
Donald Trump expanded society's villains from blacks, then to Muslims and Latinos from South and Central America. He frequently vilifies Muslims as terrorists and Latinos as criminals. Prior to the midterm elections, he politicized a caravan originating from Guatemala and forwarded a racist video on Twitter to inspire fear as a get-out-the-vote method.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, please step out into the hallway.
They're fucking dead. So fucking break out soon, and I'll kill more. The only thing that fucking regret is if I can steal too. I wish I could kill more of those motherfuckers. I'll kill more cops soon.
He says he wants to apply for pardon for the felony he committed. Attempt of murder.
Malkia Cyril of the Center for Media Justice and Kevin Gannon of Grandview University discussed the need to break the dependency of white supremacy, because when all of us are equal, we are stronger as a society.
On a much deeper level, you know, we are all interconnected in society, and our society rises or falls by the health of its institutions, and our institutions are profoundly unhealthy right now. Race and injustice are the structure that has been built up in our country since our country's beginnings, and that implicates all of us. So I think being able to say, well, this is an issue that doesn't affect me, that's a profound lack of empathy. And we survive as a society if we're able to empathize with one another.
And also, to be real, like in a prison, both the prisoner and the guard is trapped in that prison together. In a racial dynamic of white supremacy, both white people and people of color are trapped by that relationship. We all want to be free. Not only black lives, not only brown lives, but all of us want to be free. And the only way to be free is to make Black Lives Matter right now and to get off of the dependency on white supremacy.
And the white community, I mean, that's kind of the elephant in the room sometimes, is, well, what should white people do? Well, you know, it is not the job of those being oppressed to fix the oppression. You know, so what we need to realize is the white community, for lack of a better term, is that we are implicated in this system. We are responsible for the way the structures have evolved, and we have work to do.
Just as the U.S. War Department explained in the 1940s, you don't need to be black, Muslim, Hispanic, Catholic, a Mason, or any small group to be harmed. When any individual minority groups are victimized and sacrificed to the hungry appetite of the powerful and greedy, all of us in society are weakened.